In Halloween night in 1947, 17 voices sang in perfect harmony inside St. Margaret's Church in Hollow's End, Vermont. By sunrise, only 16 people remained. The 17th, a young woman named Eleanor Vance, would be found 3 days later in the bell tower. Her body aged beyond recognition, her mouth frozen open as if caught mid-song. But that's not the strangest part. The strangest part is that her vocal cords had been severed completely. And yet neighbors would swear for years afterward that they still heard her singing. This is the story of the Harvest Moon Choir, a story of tradition, devotion, and something that should never have been awakened. My name is Julian Cross, and tonight we open a file that has remained sealed for over 7 decades. A file that asks a question no one has been able to answer. What happened in that church when the clock struck midnight? Let me take you back. Back to a time when small towns in New England still held their secrets close, when communities were bound not just by proximity but by blood, by history, by rituals passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. Hollow's End was one of those places. Population 612, nestled in a valley between 2 mountain ridges, surrounded by dense forests of maple and birch that turned the landscape into a cathedral of gold and crimson every October. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, where the rhythm of life followed the seasons with a reliability that felt almost sacred. The town had been founded in 1763 by a group of Presbyterian settlers fleeing religious persecution in Massachusetts. They named it Hollow's End, not because it sat at the end of a hollow, though it did, but because they believed they had reached the end of their wandering, the end of their suffering. They built their church first, before homes, before a mill, before anything else. St. Margaret's, a modest white structure with a bell tower that could be seen from anywhere in the valley. That church became the heart of everything. Births, deaths, marriages, harvests. Every significant moment in Hollow's End passed through those doors, and every year, without fail, on October 31st, the town gathered for the Harvest Moon service. This wasn't your typical Halloween celebration. There were no costumes, no children begging for candy, no jack-o'-lanterns grinning from porches. In Hollow's End, October 31st was a night of gratitude and remembrance, a night to thank God for the harvest, to honor the dead who had worked the land before them, and to sing. Always to sing. The Harvest Moon hymn was the centerpiece of the service. No one knew who wrote it. There was no sheet music, no written record of its composition. It had been passed down orally, generation to generation, taught by ear alone. The melody was haunting, built on minor keys and intervals that didn't quite follow conventional musical structure. Locals described it as beautiful but unsettling, the kind of song that raised the hair on your arms, even as it moved you to tears. The lyrics were simple, almost primitive, a prayer for abundance, a plea for protection through the coming winter, an acknowledgement of the darkness that surrounded them. Only the choir sang it, and membership in that choir was considered one of the highest honors in Hollow's End. You didn't audition. You were chosen, selected by the choir director based on criteria that were never quite explained, but seemed to involve family lineage and some indefinable quality of voice. In 1947, the choir consisted of 17 members, ranging in age from 19 to 63. Farmers, shopkeepers, a schoolteacher, a nurse. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, bound together by this one extraordinary tradition. Eleanor Vance was the youngest, 23 years old, with dark hair she wore in the victory rolls that were fashionable in those post-war years, and a voice that people said could make angels weep. She'd been born in Hollow's End, the daughter of Robert Vance, who ran the general store, and Margaret Vance, who had died giving birth to her. Eleanor grew up helping her father behind the counter, measuring out flour and sugar, wrapping parcels in brown paper, listening to the gossip and stories that flowed through that store like water through a stream. She was quiet, polite, deeply religious. The kind of young woman that elderly ladies praised, and young men were too intimidated to court. She'd been selected for the choir at age 16, an unusually young age, and had taken to it with a devotion that bordered on obsession. She practiced constantly, humming the Harvest Moon hymn while she worked, while she walked, sometimes even in her sleep, according to her father. Other choir members joked that Eleanor had been born to sing that song, that it lived in her blood somehow. She would smile when they said things like that, but there was something in her eyes, a kind of hunger, a kind of knowing. If you're drawn to stories that refuse to let go, stories that linger long after the telling is done, then subscribe to this channel. Because the files I open here don't offer easy answers. They offer only truth, however dark that truth might be. The weeks leading up to Halloween 1947 were unremarkable. The harvest had been good, not exceptional but solid. The war had been over for 2 years, and while young men were still trickling back, still adjusting to civilian life, there was a sense of normalcy returning. Hope, even. The choir held their usual rehearsals every Sunday after regular service, gathering in the church basement, where someone would bring coffee and cookies, where they would practice the hymn until it was perfect, until their voices blended into something larger than the sum of its parts. But several choir members would later report that something felt different that year. Martha Hendricks, the oldest member at 63, said Eleanor seemed distracted, distant. She would stare at the walls during rehearsal, at places where there was nothing to see. Thomas Webb, a 40-year-old farmer with a bass voice that could rattle windows, mentioned that Eleanor had started arriving early to rehearsals, sometimes an hour before anyone else, and he'd catch her in the sanctuary alone, singing. Not the hymn they were rehearsing, but something else, something he didn't recognize. When he asked her about it, she said she'd been teaching herself an old song, but she wouldn't tell him which one or where she'd learned it. Reverend Michael Aldridge, who had led St. Margaret's for 15 years, noticed nothing unusual. He was a practical man, more concerned with the logistics of the service than the spiritual subtleties. He made sure the church was cleaned, the candles were ready, the programs were printed. He trusted his choir. He had no reason not to. October 31st, 1947, fell on a Friday. The weather was cold but clear, the kind of crisp autumn night where your breath clouds in front of you, and the stars seemed close enough to touch. The service was scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock in the evening and would run until midnight, following a structure that had remained unchanged for over a century. The townspeople would gather, Reverend Aldridge would deliver a short sermon, and then the choir would sing. First traditional hymns everyone knew, Amazing Grace, How Great Thou Art, building toward the moment when the church would fall silent and the Harvest Moon hymn would begin. People started arriving around 8:30. Families in their Sunday best, farmers in clean overalls, children scrubbed and combed and told to be on their best behavior. The church filled quickly. St. Margaret's could hold about 200 people if everyone squeezed in. And that night every pew was packed. Candles burned on the altar, casting flickering shadows across the white walls. The air smelled of wood smoke and candle wax and the lingering sweetness of autumn leaves. The choir assembled in the small room behind the sanctuary at 8:45. They wore simple robes, deep burgundy with white collars. Eleanor was among them, quiet as always. But Martha Hendricks would later tell investigators that the girl looked pale, almost translucent in the candlelight. Martha had asked if she was feeling all right, and Eleanor had smiled and said she'd never felt better, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. At 9 o'clock, Reverend Aldridge took his place at the pulpit and the service began. Nothing unusual. A reading from Ecclesiastes about seasons and times and purposes, a prayer of thanksgiving, the first hymns sung by the congregation with the choir leading, their voices strong and sure. Everything proceeded exactly as it had every year before. And then, at 11:30, the moment arrived. Reverend Aldridge nodded to the choir director, Harold Pierce, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who had been leading the choir for 20 years. Harold raised his hands and the congregation fell silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your eardrums. 200 people holding their breath. The choir stood. 17 voices, 17 souls, and they began to sing. Multiple witnesses, and there were many, described what happened next in remarkably consistent terms. The hymn started as it always did, slow, almost mournful, building gradually. But something was different. The voices were more powerful than anyone remembered, more unified, resonating through the church in a way that seemed to vibrate in your chest, in your bones. People said it felt less like listening to music and more like being inside it, surrounded by it, consumed by it. Margaret Holloway, who was 14 at the time, told investigators that she closed her eyes while they sang and saw colors, shapes, patterns that moved and breathed. Her mother, sitting beside her, reported the same thing. Others described feeling overcome with emotion, tears streaming down their faces without understanding why. Some said they felt joy, others, an inexplicable sadness. A few, the oldest members of the congregation who had heard the hymn dozens of times, said they felt fear. The song built toward its climax, toward the final verse that everyone knew was coming, the verse where the voices would reach their highest point and then descend, returning to the quiet simplicity of the opening. But when they reached that moment, something changed. The harmony shifted. A new voice emerged, high and clear and impossibly pure, rising above the others, rising and rising until it seemed to pierce through the roof of the church, through the night sky itself. It was Eleanor. Harold Pierce, the choir director, would later say that Eleanor's part didn't include a solo. There was no solo in the Harvest Moon hymn, never had been. But there she was, singing notes that shouldn't exist, holding tones that no human throat should be able to sustain. And the strangest thing, the thing that would haunt him for the rest of his life, was that he couldn't make her stop. He tried to bring the choir back, to end the song, but they kept singing, all of them, as if compelled, as if they had no choice. Eleanor's voice climbed higher and higher. The candles on the altar began to flicker, though there was no wind. Some people swore they saw the flames bend toward the choir, as if drawn by some invisible force. The temperature in the church dropped. You could see breath now, misting in the candlelight. Several children started crying. A few adults stood as if to leave, but no one moved toward the doors. Everyone was frozen, transfixed, unable to look away from the young woman in the burgundy robe whose voice had become something otherworldly. And then, at exactly midnight, the church bell rang. One deep, resonant tone that seemed to shake the foundation. The singing stopped, instantly. All 17 voices cutting off at the same moment, leaving a silence that felt somehow louder than the music had been. Eleanor swayed. Her eyes, which several people said had been closed throughout her solo, opened. For just a moment, witnesses reported, they looked black. Not the pupils, not the irises, the entire eye from corner to corner, black as pitch. Then she collapsed. The congregation erupted, people shouting, moving, pushing toward the front. Harold Pierce jumped down from the choir platform and reached Eleanor first, cradling her head. She was breathing, but barely, her pulse rapid and thready. Reverend Aldridge called for Dr. Henry Morrison, who was in the third pew, and the doctor rushed forward, bag in hand. But here's what no one noticed in the chaos. While everyone crowded around Eleanor, while the doctor examined her and the reverend tried to calm the panicking congregation, the rest of the choir was quietly exiting through the side door, filing out into the night in silence, still in their robes, returning to their homes as if nothing unusual had happened, as if they'd just completed another successful Harvest Moon service. It would be morning before anyone realized that something was wrong. Dr. Morrison examined Eleanor right there on the floor of the sanctuary. Her vital signs were weak but stable. No obvious injuries, no signs of seizure or stroke. He suspected exhaustion, perhaps a fainting spell brought on by the exertion of singing. He recommended moving her to his office for observation, but Robert Vance, Eleanor's father, insisted on taking her home. He carried his daughter out of the church in his arms, and the crowd parted to let them pass. The congregation dispersed slowly, people lingering in small groups outside, speaking in hushed tones about what they'd witnessed. Most agreed it had been the most powerful performance of the Harvest Moon hymn they'd ever heard. Some called it transcendent. A few, the ones who had felt that inexplicable fear, said nothing at all. They simply went home, locked their doors, and tried to forget the sound of Eleanor Vance's voice climbing towards something that didn't want to be reached. By Saturday morning, November 1st, Eleanor had not woken up. Dr. Morrison visited the Vance home and found her in a deep, unresponsive sleep. He could rouse her slightly, enough to make her swallow water, but she wouldn't open her eyes, wouldn't speak. Her father sat by her bedside, holding her hand, praying. The doctor had no explanation. He suggested it might be some kind of shock, trauma from the intensity of the experience. He said to give her time, to keep her comfortable, to have faith. But faith was becoming a complicated thing in Hollow's End. Because on Saturday afternoon, when the choir gathered at Harold Pierce's home for what was meant to be a casual post-service debriefing, something became clear. None of them remembered the end of the hymn. Not clearly. They remembered starting, remembered the familiar verses, remembered the harmonies they'd practiced 100 times. But the climax, Eleanor's solo, the moment when everything changed, it existed in their memories like a dream, fragmented and uncertain. Martha Hendricks said it felt like trying to recall something that happened to someone else. Thomas Webb said he remembered singing but couldn't remember what came out of his mouth, which made no sense even to him. Only Harold Pierce remembered it all, and what he remembered made him sick with a dread he couldn't name. Sunday came. Eleanor still hadn't woken. Reverend Aldridge led a normal service, no choir, no mention of what had happened on Friday night. But the congregation was smaller than usual, and those who came seemed distracted, troubled. People kept glancing at the empty choir platform, at the spot where Eleanor had stood. And then came Monday, November 3rd, the day everything fell apart. Thomas Webb's daughter had gone to play in the woods behind their farm, something she did every day, a perfectly normal thing. She came running back an hour later, screaming, incoherent. Thomas ran with her to the place she pointed, a small clearing they used sometimes for picnics. There, carved into the trunk of an old oak tree, were symbols, dozens of them covering the bark in a spiral pattern that made your eyes hurt to follow. They were old, Thomas said. The cuts were weathered, dark with age, but he'd been in those woods his entire life. Those symbols had never been there before. That same afternoon, Martha Hendricks reported hearing singing coming from St. Margaret's. She'd been walking past on her way to the market when she heard it. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing the Harvest Moon hymn. The church was empty. The doors were locked. She looked in through the windows and saw nothing, no one. But she heard it. She was certain. By Tuesday, other choir members were reporting strange experiences, voices in the night, dreams of standing in the church, singing, but when they looked down at their hands, they saw they were transparent, fading, becoming part of the music itself. One man, David Foster, woke his wife in a panic because he said he couldn't remember his daughter's name. It came back to him after a few terrifying minutes, but the fact that it had left at all shook him to his core. Reverend Aldridge tried to maintain calm, to provide rational explanations. Stress, he said, guilt over Eleanor's condition, the power of suggestion, but even he was beginning to doubt. Because on Tuesday night, he went to the church alone to pray, to seek guidance, and when he knelt at the altar, he heard it too, singing, faint but unmistakable, coming from above him, from the bell tower. He told no one. Not then. But the next morning, Wednesday, November 5th, when Robert Vance came running into the town square screaming that Eleanor was gone, that her bed was empty, that she'd vanished in the night, Reverend Aldridge knew where to look. If this story has you questioning what you thought you knew about the world, about the things we pass down through generations, then stay with me, because what they found in that bell tower would challenge everything the people of Hollow's End believed about their town, their history, and themselves. The search began immediately. Robert Vance was beside himself, organizing every able-bodied person in town to comb the streets, the fields, the woods. Dr. Morrison feared Eleanor had wandered off in some kind of fugue state, disoriented and vulnerable. The temperature had dropped below freezing overnight. If she was outside, if she wasn't dressed properly, she might not survive. But Reverend Aldridge had a different fear. He didn't join the search parties. Instead, he walked to St. Margaret's, took the key from his pocket and unlocked the front doors. The church was cold, silent. He stood in the center aisle, looking up at the ceiling, at the bell tower entrance visible through the small door behind the pulpit. He'd been to the bell tower before, of course, many times. It was where the old rope pull mechanism for the bell was housed, along with various storage items, forgotten hymnals, broken pews. A dusty, cramped space that no one had any reason to visit regularly. The stairs leading up were narrow and steep, more of a ladder than a proper staircase. Aldridge climbed, Each step echoed in the empty church. His breath came in short gasps, partly from exertion, but mostly from the fear that was building in his chest, the certainty that he was about to see something he could never unsee. At the top, he pushed open the trapdoor and pulled himself up into the bell tower. The smell hit him first. Decay. Sweet and rotten and wrong. He covered his mouth, fighting the urge to vomit, and looked around the small space. Light filtered through the slats in the walls, illuminating dust motes that danced in the cold air. The bell hung above him, silent and massive, and there, in the corner, crumpled on the wooden floor like a discarded garment, was Eleanor Vance. Aldridge knew she was dead before he crossed the space to her. There's a quality to death, a stillness that is unmistakable. But when he reached her, when he saw her fully, he staggered back, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. She looked ancient. Her dark hair had turned completely white and brittle. Her skin, which had been smooth and young just days before, was now wrinkled and spotted, stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, too sharp. Her hands were skeletal, the fingers curled like claws. But worst of all was her face. Her eyes were open, milky and unseeing, but her mouth was frozen in an oval, stretched wide as if she'd died mid-song or mid-scream. It was impossible to tell which. Aldridge backed toward the trapdoor, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Eleanor had been 23. The body before him looked like it belonged to a woman of 90 or more, 5 days. She'd been unconscious for 5 days, and somehow, impossibly, she had aged 70 years. He climbed down, his hands shaking so badly he nearly fell. He locked the church behind him and went directly to find Dr. Morrison and Sheriff Clayton Burke. He told them what he'd found, and he watched their faces cycle through disbelief, concern, and finally, a grim acceptance that something beyond their understanding had occurred. The 3 men returned to the church together. Sheriff Burke brought his deputy, Jack Sullivan, who was young and strong, and didn't believe in anything he couldn't punch or arrest. They climbed to the bell tower. They saw what Aldridge had seen, and to their credit, they didn't run. They documented everything. The deputy took photographs. The doctor conducted a preliminary examination right there, unwilling to move the body until he understood what he was dealing with. What Dr. Morrison found made no medical sense. Eleanor's vocal cords, he discovered, had been severed, not cut with a blade, but torn, ripped apart, as if from some tremendous internal force. There was no blood, no sign of external injury, just this catastrophic damage to the very mechanism that had produced her incredible voice, and the aging. Her bones were brittle, her organs atrophied, her skin thin as tissue paper. Every marker pointed to extreme old age, except it had happened in less than a week. How had she gotten to the bell tower? The church had been locked. No one had seen her leave her home. Dr. Morrison theorized she might have wandered there during one of his visits, that perhaps she'd slipped out while her father was distracted. But Robert Vance swore he'd never left her side, that he'd watched her every moment. There were no answers, only questions that multiplied like shadows at sunset. The death of Eleanor Vance was officially ruled as cause unknown. Dr. Morrison submitted his findings to the State Medical Board, who reviewed the case and promptly closed it, offering no explanation for the discrepancies. The body was released to Robert Vance, who buried his daughter in a closed casket in the cemetery behind St. Margaret's. The funeral was small, quiet. People were afraid, not of Eleanor, but of what had happened to her, of the implications, because this was a God-fearing community. They believed in miracles, in divine intervention, in the power of prayer and faith. But this felt like something else. This felt like a door had been opened that should have remained shut, and no one knew how to close it. The investigation, such as it was, fell to Sheriff Burke. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, but he was also thorough. He interviewed every member of the choir, every person who had attended the service, every resident of Hollow's End, who might have seen or heard something useful. He filled notebooks with testimonies, observations, theories. What emerged was a picture of a community grappling with collective trauma. People reported strange occurrences, not just the choir members, but others too. Lights in the forest at night, singing carried on the wind, dreams of the church, of the bell tower, of Eleanor's voice calling to them. Children refused to go near St. Margaret's. Dogs would bark and howl whenever they passed the building. And then there were the symbols Thomas Webb had found in the woods. Sheriff Burke investigated those personally, bringing along Harold Pierce, who had studied some history in college. Pierce examined the carvings and went pale. He said they looked like protection sigils, the kind used in old folk magic, the kind settlers might have employed when they first came to this valley. He said if these markings were real, if they'd been here all along, it suggested the founders of Hollow's End had been afraid of something, afraid enough to carve warnings into the trees. Burke ordered the symbols documented and photographed, then had the tree cut down and burned. He didn't explain why. He just said it needed to be done. The question everyone kept asking was, how did Eleanor die? But Burke began to suspect that was the wrong question. The right question was, what did Eleanor's death accomplish? He shared this theory with Reverend Aldridge one evening in mid-November, the two of them sitting in the Reverend's study, nursing whiskey and watching the fire burn low. Burke said he'd been thinking about the Harvest Moon hymn, about how it had been passed down for generations with no written record, about how only certain people were chosen to sing it. He said traditions like that don't survive by accident. They survive because they serve a purpose. Aldridge asked what purpose could possibly require the death of a young woman. Burke didn't have an answer, but he suggested that maybe, just maybe, the hymn wasn't a prayer. Maybe it was a sacrifice. And maybe Eleanor had been chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of her voice and everything to do with something older, something darker, something the founders of this town had understood, but their descendants had forgotten. Aldridge wanted to dismiss this as nonsense, as the desperate speculation of a man trying to make sense of the senseless. But he couldn't, because he'd been reading the church records, the original documents from 1763, and he'd found something troubling. A notation, barely legible, written in the margin of the first pastor's journal. It said, "We give thanks for the binding. May it hold through the ages. May the sacrifice be honored. May the hollow never claim us." The hollow. Hollow's End. Aldridge showed Burke the entry. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Burke asked if the Reverend believed in evil. Not sin, not human wickedness, but genuine, supernatural evil. Aldridge said he believed in God, and if God was real, then so was his opposite. Burke nodded. He said he thought whatever the founders had bound, whatever they'd been protecting the town from, might have been weakening. And the hymn, sung every year, might have been the reinforcement, the renewal of the binding. But something had gone wrong this year. Eleanor had changed the hymn. Whether intentionally or through some outside influence, she'd altered it, added that solo, pushed the ritual beyond its intended boundaries, and the binding hadn't been reinforced. It had been broken. Now the question was, what had they released? December brought the first real snowfall, and with it, a kind of forced calm. The strange occurrences didn't stop, but people stopped talking about them. They learned to live with the singing they heard on certain nights, with the dreams that left them gasping in the dark, with the feeling that Hollow's End had become a different place, somewhere changed and charged with unseen tension. Robert Vance closed his general store. He couldn't bear to be around people, couldn't tolerate their sympathy or their questions. He spent his days in his house, curtains drawn, grieving a daughter he'd lost twice, once to whatever force had taken her, and again to a death that defied explanation. The choir disbanded. Harold Pierce announced in early December that there would be no more rehearsals, no more performances. Several members had already left town, claiming family obligations or job opportunities elsewhere. The truth was simpler. They were running, trying to put distance between themselves and the memory of that night, the sensation of singing words they couldn't remember, of being used as instruments for something they didn't understand. Martha Hendricks stayed. She was too old to start over somewhere else, she said. But she began attending a different church, a Methodist congregation 2 towns over. She never set foot in St. Margaret's again. Christmas came and went, with little celebration. The New Year arrived cold and bleak. And then, in late January of 1948, something shifted. The strange occurrences stopped, the singing ceased, the dreams faded. It was as if whatever force had been disturbed by Eleanor's death had finally settled, appeased or exhausted, or simply moved on. Sheriff Burke filed his final report on the case. Cause of death, undetermined. Contributing factors, possible seizure or stroke during the church service, leading to disorientation and accidental injury. He knew it was insufficient. He knew it explained nothing. But what else could he write? That a young woman had been consumed by a song? That a 200-year-old ritual had gone wrong and opened a door to something hungry? They'd lock him up. Reverend Aldridge struggled with his faith. He'd devoted his life to serving God, to shepherding his flock, and he'd presided over an event that had killed one of his congregants and traumatized an entire town. He prayed for guidance, for understanding. What he received instead was a terrible certainty that some questions aren't meant to be answered, that some knowledge is too dangerous for human minds to hold. In March, the Church Council met to discuss the future of the Harvest Moon service. The vote was unanimous. The tradition would end. There would be no more services on October 31st. The hymn would not be sung again. Someone suggested destroying the church records, burning any reference to the ritual, ensuring it could never be resurrected. But Aldridge refused. He said erasure wasn't the answer. Memory was. Future generations needed to know what had happened, needed to understand the cost of their ancestors' choices. So the records were sealed instead, placed in a locked box in the church basement, with instructions that they not be opened for 50 years. Let time create distance, Aldridge thought. Let the pain fade before anyone tries to understand. But here's something they discovered only later, something that would haunt those who learned of it. Eleanor Vance had kept a journal. Her father found it in April, hidden beneath a floorboard in her room. He read it once, then burned it in his fireplace, watching the pages curl and blacken. But not before copying a single entry, dated October 15, 1947, 2 weeks before her death. The entry read, "I heard it again last night, the voice beneath the voice, the song inside the song. It's been there all along, woven into the hymn, like thread through cloth. I don't think anyone else can hear it, or maybe they choose not to, but I can't unhear it now. It's calling to me, teaching me, showing me what the hymn was meant to do before they changed it, before they made it safe. There's power in those words, in those notes, real power, the kind that opens doors, the kind that demands payment. I think I'm supposed to pay it. I think that's why I was chosen. Not for my voice, but for my willingness. My faith. I'm not afraid. I'm ready. Whatever happens on Halloween, I'm ready." Robert Vance shared this entry with Sheriff Burke and Reverend Aldridge. Then he too left Hollow's End, moving west to live with a cousin in Oregon. He died in 1953, never having spoken publicly about his daughter again. So what really happened in St. Margaret's Church on October 31st, 1947? What killed Eleanor Vance? I've spent months researching this case, combing through newspaper archives, county records, interviewing descendants of the people who were there. I've read the sealed documents, which were finally opened in 1998. I've listened to the only known recording of the Harvest Moon hymn, a crackling, barely audible tape made by someone in the congregation that night, who had a wire recorder hidden in their coat. And I'll tell you what I found. I found a story that doesn't fit into comfortable categories. A story that resists rational explanation, even as it begs for one. The medical facts are clear. Eleanor Vance's body underwent rapid, catastrophic aging. Her vocal cords were destroyed from the inside. She died in that bell tower alone in a state of physical impossibility. Those are facts. Everything else is interpretation. The skeptical view, the one most people default to, is that Eleanor suffered some kind of rare medical condition. Perhaps a form of progeria that manifested suddenly, accelerated by the stress of the performance. Perhaps a stroke that caused hallucinations and self-harm. Perhaps something else we don't have a name for yet. Some cruel trick of biology that mimicked the supernatural. But that doesn't explain the symbols in the woods. It doesn't explain the collective experiences of the choir members. It doesn't explain the journal entry or the 200-year-old warning in the church records. It doesn't explain why, according to multiple witnesses, Eleanor's eyes turned black. The supernatural view is harder to articulate because it requires accepting premises most of us reject. It requires believing that Hollow's End was founded on top of something some presence or force that the settlers feared, that they developed the harvest moon hymn as a binding ritual, a way to contain or appease this force, that the ritual worked for nearly 2 centuries, passed down through generations who understood its purpose even if they couldn't explain it, and that Eleanor, whether through her own curiosity or some outside influence, broke the ritual. She sang the original version, the dangerous version, the one with real power, and that power consumed her. There's a third interpretation, one I find myself drawn to. It's less tidy than either of the others, less satisfying in its way, but it feels closer to the truth of human experience, to the way we stumble through a world that doesn't owe us clarity. I think Eleanor Vance believed, with such fervor, such complete conviction, that she became a conduit for something. Whether that something was supernatural or psychological, external or internal, doesn't matter. She opened herself to it completely. She gave herself over to the song, to the tradition, to the idea that she had been chosen for a sacred purpose. And that belief, that absolute surrender, killed her. We do this, we humans. We create rituals and imbue them with meaning. We build traditions that bind communities together, that provide structure and purpose. But sometimes those traditions become prisons. Sometimes the meaning we create becomes a monster that devours us. Eleanor sang herself to death because she believed it was her destiny, her calling. And whether there was any truth to that belief, or whether it was simply a story she told herself, doesn't change the outcome. She died, and Hollow's End changed. And a tradition that had survived for 200 years ended in blood and fear and unanswered questions. If stories like this haunt you the way they haunt me, if you lie awake at night wondering about the things we can't explain, the questions we can't answer, then you belong here. Subscribe. Because every file I open leads to 10 more. Every answer reveals a dozen new mysteries, and I'm not stopping until I've read them all. Today, Hollow's End is a ghost town. Not literally. There are still about 100 people living there, mostly retirees and families who never left. But St. Margaret's Church closed in 1982, the victim of declining membership and an aging building that no one wanted to pay to repair. It still stands, though. White paint peeling, bell tower leaning slightly to the left, windows broken by teenagers or storms or time. You can visit if you want. The door isn't even locked anymore. There's nothing left to protect. I went there last October, stood in the sanctuary where Eleanor sang her final song. The pews are gone, hauled away and sold. The altar is bare, but the acoustics are still remarkable. I clapped my hands once, and the sound echoed for seconds, bouncing off the walls, multiplying until it sounded like applause, like an audience I couldn't see. I climbed to the bell tower. The stairs are treacherous now, rotted through in places, but I was careful. I needed to see the space where they found her. It's smaller than I imagined, cramped and dark and cold, even in the afternoon sun. The bell is gone, sold for scrap decades ago. But you can still see the outline of where Eleanor's body lay, a stain on the wooden floor that never quite came clean, despite repeated scrubbings. I stood there for a long time, trying to feel something, trying to sense some residual energy, some echo of what happened. And I did feel something, though I can't say if it was supernatural or simply the weight of knowing what transpired in that space. A sadness, a thickness in the air, the sense that I was intruding on a place where someone had suffered terribly, where someone had been transformed against their will or perhaps because of their will. And the distinction between those two possibilities felt suddenly meaningless. Before I left, I did something I'm not entirely proud of. I sang. Just a few notes, nothing elaborate. I wanted to hear what Eleanor heard, to experience even a fraction of what drew her to that hymn. My voice is unremarkable, untrained. But in that bell tower, in that small space with its strange acoustics, even my crude attempt resonated in unexpected ways. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, to vibrate not just in the air, but in my chest, my skull. For just a moment I understood the seduction of it, the feeling that your voice is connecting to something larger, something that existed before you and will exist after you're gone. The desire to surrender to that feeling, to let it carry you wherever it wants to go. Then I stopped, because I could feel myself wanting to continue, wanting to see how high I could push my voice, how far I could go. And that want felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. So I left. I climbed down from that tower and walked out of that church and got in my car and drove away. But I took something with me. Not a physical object. I'm not that foolish. I took a question. The question that has driven me through every case I've ever investigated, every file I've ever opened. What are we willing to sacrifice for belief? Eleanor Vance sacrificed everything. Her youth, her life, her very self. For what? For a tradition she thought was sacred. For a song she believed held power. For a community that had chosen her for reasons she couldn't fully understand. We'll never know. We can't know. She left us only that one journal entry, those few cryptic sentences that raise more questions than they answer. But here's what we do know. Belief is a force, not supernatural, not magical, but absolutely undeniably real. What we believe shapes what we see, what we experience, what we're capable of. Eleanor believed she was meant to sing that song, and that belief led her to a bell tower where she died in a state that medical science cannot adequately explain. Was she right? Was there really something beneath the hymn, some hidden truth that only she could perceive? Or did her conviction create its own reality, bending the world around her until the impossible became actual? I don't know. I've been investigating cases like this for 15 years, and I still don't know. Maybe the answer is that both things are true simultaneously. Maybe belief and reality aren't separate categories, but different expressions of the same underlying mystery. The people of Hollow's End carried on. They had to. Life doesn't stop for tragedy, for questions that can't be answered. The choir members who stayed in town lived out their lives, and most of them are gone now. Martha Hendricks died in 1973, peacefully in her sleep according to her obituary. Thomas Webb passed in 1981. Harold Pierce lived until 1995, teaching music at the local school, and never, according to his family, singing another note after that Halloween night. Reverend Aldridge left St. Margaret's in 1950, taking a position at a church in Boston. He told the church council he needed a change, a fresh start. But his replacement, Reverend David Walsh, found Aldridge's personal papers in the church office, and among them was a letter the Reverend had written but never sent. It was addressed to the regional bishop, requesting guidance about what a pastor should do when he suspects the rituals he's been performing might be dangerous. The letter ended with a single line. I fear we have been worshipping at the altar of something we don't understand, and I fear that ignorance has cost us dearly. The sealed records were opened in 1998, as Aldridge had specified. A local historian named Patricia Chen reviewed them and wrote a paper for a small academic journal about folk traditions and religious syncretism in early New England. Her paper mentioned the Harvest Moon hymn and Eleanor's death, but treated them as historical curiosities, examples of how isolated communities can develop elaborate rituals that take on outsized importance. She made no mention of the more disturbing elements, the aging, the severed vocal cords, the suggestion of something supernatural. When I contacted her to ask why, she said those details were unverifiable, possibly embellished over time, and including them would have undermined her credibility as a scholar. I understood her position, but I also thought, this is how we lose the truth. This is how stories get sanitized, reduced to comfortable narratives that don't challenge our understanding of reality. We file away the uncomfortable parts, the pieces that don't fit, and we tell ourselves we're being rational, skeptical, scientific. But sometimes the uncomfortable parts are the most important ones. In 2003, a developer tried to buy the church and the land around it, planning to demolish the building and construct vacation homes. The deal fell through for reasons that were never made entirely clear. According to county records, the developer cited irregularities in the title and concerns about environmental remediation, but local residents told a different story. They said the construction crew that came to survey the property refused to return after the first day. The foreman apparently told the developer that something was wrong with the site, that his men had experienced unexplained equipment failures, severe headaches, and a pervasive sense of being unwelcome. He recommended abandoning the project. The developer tried to hire a different crew. Same result. After the third attempt, he gave up and sold the property at a loss to a conservation trust that promised to maintain it as undeveloped land. St. Margaret's still stands, slowly collapsing under the weight of winters and neglect. There's one more detail I need to share with you, one more piece of this puzzle that I've been holding back because I wasn't sure what to make of it, and I'm still not sure. In 2010, a music ethnographer named Dr. Sarah Blackwood was doing research on American folk hymns. She'd heard about the Harvest Moon hymn from Patricia Chen's paper and was intrigued by the idea of an oral tradition that had survived for 200 years without written notation. She managed to track down that recording I mentioned, the wire recording made during the 1947 service. The quality was poor, but it was the only surviving capture of the hymn as performed by the original choir. Dr. Blackwood ran the recording through audio analysis software, looking for patterns, trying to reverse engineer the musical structure. What she found disturbed her enough that she published her findings in an academic journal, with a warning that readers should approach the material with caution. The hymn, she discovered, contained subsonic frequencies, notes below the range of human hearing, but present nonetheless in the way the voices harmonized. These frequencies created what's called binaural beats, a phenomenon where the brain perceives a tone that isn't actually present in the audio, generated by the interaction of two different frequencies. Binaural beats can induce altered states of consciousness. They're used in meditation, in therapeutic contexts, but they can also cause disorientation, anxiety, even hallucinations if the frequencies are wrong or if the listener is particularly susceptible. The Harvest Moon hymn, according to Dr. Blackwood's analysis, was effectively a neurological weapon. Whether intentional or accidental, it had been structured in a way that would affect anyone listening, creating a shared altered state among the congregation. The subsonic elements would have been especially powerful for the singers themselves, who were producing the sounds and therefore experiencing them more intensely than the audience. Dr. Blackwood theorized that Eleanor, as the youngest and possibly most sensitive member of the choir, might have been overwhelmed by these frequencies, that her solo, her attempt to push beyond the established structure, might have involved producing even lower tones, pushing her voice into ranges that put catastrophic stress on her vocal cords. Combine that with a possibly undiagnosed medical condition, with the psychological stress of performance, with the power of collective belief, and you have the ingredients for a perfect storm of physical and mental breakdown. It's a compelling theory. It's rational, grounded in science, and it explains several key elements of the case. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the aging. It doesn't explain how Eleanor got from her bed to the bell tower without anyone seeing her. It doesn't explain the symbols in the woods or the experiences of dozens of other people who had no direct exposure to the hymn. What it does do is remind us that our ancestors were smarter than we often give them credit for. The founders of Hollow's End might not have understood the neurological mechanisms of binaural beats, but they could have discovered through trial and error that certain combinations of voices, certain patterns of harmony, produced profound effects on listeners. They could have codified this knowledge into a ritual, a tradition, without fully understanding the science behind it. And if they knew the hymn had power, if they deliberately structured it to induce altered states, what else might they have known? What else might they have been trying to achieve? I contacted Dr. Blackwood last year to ask if she'd be willing to discuss her findings. She declined. She told me via email that she regretted publishing the paper, that she'd received disturbing correspondence from people who wanted the hymn recreated, who believed it could be used for various purposes, ranging from spiritual enlightenment to mind control. She'd since destroyed her copies of the recording and removed herself from any further research into the topic. I can't say I blame her. Some knowledge feels dangerous even to contemplate. Some doors, once you realize they exist, are better left closed. But I'm a person who opens doors. It's what I do. It's why you're listening to this. And I've thought a lot about whether I should even tell this story, whether sharing it might inspire someone to try to recreate the hymn, to seek out the few remaining people who remember it, to experiment with subsonic frequencies and altered states and the power of collective belief. In the end, I decided that silence is more dangerous than knowledge, that the real risk isn't in understanding what happened, but in forgetting. Because this story isn't really about a haunted hymn, or a supernatural force, or even a tragic death. It's about the ways we can harm each other and ourselves through the very things we think are protecting us, through tradition, through ritual, through belief that becomes so powerful, it stops being about connection to something greater and becomes instead a prison, a demand, a hungry thing that consumes whoever feeds it most faithfully. Eleanor Vance was 23 years old when she died. She loved to sing. She loved her community. She believed she had been chosen for something important, and she gave herself to that belief completely. Whether what killed her was supernatural or natural, whether it was an external force or her own faith turned toxic, the result is the same. A young woman is dead. A community is traumatized. A tradition is ended. And we're left with questions we can't answer and a warning we can barely articulate. Be careful what you devote yourself to. Be careful what you surrender to. Be careful what songs you sing and what voices you follow into the dark. The last time anyone reported hearing singing from St. Margaret's Church was October 31st, 2011, the 64th anniversary of Eleanor's death. A couple hiking in the area told local police they'd heard a woman's voice coming from the abandoned building around midnight, high and clear and heartbreakingly beautiful. They said it raised the hair on their arms, made them want to cry and run at the same time. By the time police arrived to investigate, the singing had stopped. They found nothing unusual. No signs of trespass, no indication anyone had been in the building recently. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was wishful thinking or the power of suggestion. Two people who'd heard the legend and convinced themselves they were experiencing it. Maybe it was exactly what they said it was, a voice singing in the darkness, following a pattern laid down decades before. I don't know which explanation I prefer. They're all equally unsettling in their own ways. What I do know is this. Eleanor Vance has been dead for 78 years. Her name appears on a small headstone in the cemetery behind the church that killed her. Most people who visit Hollow's End don't even notice it. There's nothing to mark it as special, as belonging to someone whose death defied explanation and haunted an entire community. But I noticed it. I stood in front of that grave last October, the autumn leaves swirling around my feet, the air cold and sharp in my lungs, and I thought about a young woman who heard something in a song that no one else could hear, who believed she was called to something greater, who sang until her voice destroyed her. I thought about how many of us do versions of the same thing, how we chase callings and vocations and purposes that consume us, how we sacrifice ourselves, our health, our relationships, our sanity, on the altar of belief, how we tell ourselves it means something, that the suffering is worth it, that we've been chosen for this pain. Maybe that's the real horror of Eleanor Vance's story. Not that something supernatural killed her, but that something entirely human did. The need to matter, the hunger to be special, the willingness to burn ourselves up if it means we shine brightly enough for others to notice. She sang and she died, and the song went on without her. That's the truth of it. The Harvest Moon hymn is gone now, extinct, but music continues. Traditions end and new ones begin. Communities change and adapt and forget. Life, despite every tragedy, persists. But sometimes on quiet nights, I think about that bell tower, about Eleanor's body aged beyond recognition, mouth frozen open, and I wonder what she saw in those final moments, what she understood, whether in the instant before death she realized she'd been used by the song, by the tradition, by her own desperate need for transcendence, or whether she died believing she'd succeeded in something sacred, something worth the cost. I hope it was the latter. I hope she found meaning in her suffering, even if that meaning was an illusion, because the alternative, that she died confused and terrified and betrayed by everything she'd devoted herself to, is too painful to contemplate. But hope and truth aren't the same thing, and I deal in truth, even when it's ugly, even when it doesn't satisfy, even when it leaves us with more questions than we started with. The file on Eleanor Vance remains open in my mind, unsolved, unresolved, a story without an ending, or with too many possible endings, none of them quite fitting the shape of what we want to believe about the world. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some stories aren't meant to be solved. Maybe they're meant to haunt us, to follow us, to remind us that we live in a world far stranger and more complex than our comfortable narratives can contain. If you've stayed with me through this story, if you've followed me down into the dark places where Eleanor went and didn't return, then you understand what this channel is about. It's not about closure, it's not about solving mysteries or finding the truth behind every question. It's about bearing witness. It's about remembering the people who fell through the cracks of history, who died in ways that don't make sense, who left us with nothing but their absence and our confusion. Eleanor Vance deserves to be remembered. Not as a cautionary tale, not as a ghost story, but as a person. A young woman who loved music and community and believed in something beyond herself. Who made choices or had choices made for her that led to a lonely death in a bell tower in a small Vermont town that most people have never heard of. I've told you her story. The facts as I understand them. The theories that try to explain the unexplainable. The lingering questions that refuse to die even as the people who could answer them turn to dust. Now it's your turn. What do you believe? What do you think really happened on that Halloween night in 1947? Was Eleanor a victim of supernatural forces, of medical catastrophe, of her own faith, or of something else entirely? Turn it over in your mind. Let it trouble you. Let it change the way you think about tradition, about belief, about the price we pay for devotion. And if you find yourself haunted by this story, if it follows you into your dreams the way it's followed me, then you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe, share. Become part of this community of people who refuse to forget, who insist on looking at the darkness and acknowledging what we find there. Because the midnight hour is approaching, and there are so many more files to open, so many more stories to tell, so many more voices calling out from the past, demanding to be heard. Eleanor Vance sang until her voice broke, until her body failed, until death claimed her in ways that science struggles to explain, and that faith cannot quite reconcile. But her story doesn't end there. It ends here, now, with you, listening, with you, remembering, with you, carrying forward the question she left behind. What happens when we give ourselves completely to something greater, and that something turns out to be hungry? Sleep well tonight, if you can. And if you hear singing in the darkness, if you feel called to follow a voice that promises transcendence, remember Eleanor. Remember what devotion costs. Remember that some songs are meant to be heard, not sung. This has been The Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross, and the story of Eleanor Vance, the Harvest Moon Choir, and the night that Halloween became something other than a celebration will stay with me forever. Perhaps now it will stay with you too. The file closes, but the questions remain, as they always do, as they always will. Until the next case, until the next mystery, until the next voice calls out from the past, asking to be remembered, demanding to be heard, refusing to be silent. I'll be here, in the dark, opening files, telling stories, seeking truth in places where truth hides from the light. And if you need me, if another mystery finds you, if another story demands to be told, you know where to find me. The midnight hour is always approaching, and there's always another file waiting to be opened. Good night, and remember, some songs should never be sung, some doors should never be opened, some questions should never be asked. But we ask them anyway, because that's what makes us human. That's what drives us forward into the unknown, even when the unknown might destroy us. Eleanor understood that, she lived it, she died for it. Now you understand it too, the Midnight File. Where stories don't end, they only wait, in the darkness, for someone brave enough or foolish enough to bring them back into the light.